Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into the neuroscience of trauma, exploring how traumatic experiences can change the brain, affect the body, and influence our health long after the event has passed. We're joined by Dr. Ruth Lanius, a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and internationally recognized expert on trauma, PTSD, and dissociation. She is a professor of psychiatry and Harris Woodman Chair in Mind-Body Medicine at Western University. With more than 200 scientific publications, Dr. Lanius is specialized in treating and researching the mind-body effect of trauma. Her latest book, Sensory Pathways to Healing from Trauma, explores how healing can happen not only by talking about traumatic memories, but through the nervous system and our sensory experiences. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Lanius. Shall we begin?
Sure, it's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm sure everybody already asked you this question multiple times, but just for our audience, what is trauma?
Trauma is an event that makes us feel horrified, where we're threatened often that we lose our lives. It's an event that often has a huge effect on both our brain and our bodies because the two are very connected in a feedback loop. So I think the two cannot be separated.
So what did you particularly observe, for example, in the brain imaging studies about, people that have experienced trauma or people with the PTSD?
There is a network in the brain that really regulates how our heartbeat beats. And this network is really important to really facilitate the brain-body connection. But in PTSD, this can become disrupted. And the association between the variability of the heart rate and the brain cannot be as associated as in healthy individuals. So this is one piece of evidence for this brain-body disconnect. So I think when we look at brain changes in the aftermath of trauma, it's an adaptation of the brain, a brilliant adaptation to survive. And I think one of the biggest adaptations that we see that drive the brain-body disconnect is that in the aftermath of trauma, the lower part of the brain, so the brainstem and the midbrain, we call it the survival brain, is actually below our conscious awareness, and it allows us to react without thinking very quickly within milliseconds. And in the aftermath of trauma, this survival brain really is in the driver's seat. And what we're moving towards in the aftermath of trauma, when we heal from trauma, is really fully reconnecting the survival brain with our cortical brain or our reflective brain.
Which part of the brain you have observed that are activating during those traumatic events or post-traumatic events?
I'd like to rephrase the question, actually.
Please.
Because the brain does not work as single parts. That's not how the brain works. We as humans like to think about it like that because it's simpler to understand. But the brain actually functions as networks. And so what we're seeing in the aftermath of trauma is that networks are disrupted. So how certain parts of the brain fire together is disrupted, and how they switch from one network to the next can be disrupted. So the brain consists of billions of neurons. And the way the brain functions is that when we're engaged in certain activities, a number of brain areas fire together. And that's called a network. And I think people always assume, one or two areas of the brain are responsible for post-traumatic stress. They always ask, what's the Bob? Who's the Bob that's responsible for post-traumatic stress? I don't think that's a correct way of thinking about it. I think we need to think in a much larger scale, and we need to think about, what are the networks involved in post-traumatic stress?
We hear a lot about post-stress traumatic disorder, and a lot of people are talking about triggers, flashback. What do you think are the misconceptions?
So I think one of the big misconceptions still is that post-traumatic stress disorder only affects veterans or military personnel. I think we're learning more about that, but we're also learning that first responders are very affected. and people who've been involved in motor vehicle accidents, natural disasters, and of course childhood trauma is a huge cause of post-traumatic stress disorder.
What kind of emotion have you observed in the aftermath of a trauma?
You can have too much or too little emotion in the aftermath of trauma. When we see too much emotion, we can see terror, we can see fear, we can see intense sadness, grief, panic, anger, shame, and guilt. But we can also see the other spectrum. We can see people who are numbed out, who feel dead inside, who've lost the capacity to feel alive, and who've lost the capacity to really feel both positive and negative emotions. They often report, I no longer feel fully alive because I can't feel a lot of emotions. And this also leads to a lot of guilt. For example, if they can't feel love for their partner or for their children because they're so numbed out.
Do you think that some health disease, chronic disease, or life-threatening disease can be particularly visible in people that have experienced trauma?
Well, we know that stress and trauma can increase inflammation, for example, both in the brain and in the body. And inflammation has been associated with a number of chronic illnesses, as well as depression and PTSD.
Trauma, is that something that will accelerate, let's say, our brain activity or accelerate our behavior, for example?
No, I don't think I would see it that way. I think trauma disconnects the lower parts of the brain from the higher parts of the brain, and they can't fully communicate in a feedback loop. Our higher brain can't update to safety and can't take in the sensory cues that things are safe now, I'm no longer in danger. And so as a result, traumatized individuals often feel like the past is ever present and that they keep getting stuck in the past, which again is very adaptive because you always expect the worst. And that increases your chance of survival, but it comes at a great cost that you can't update to the present and that you can't fully embrace safety. That's a brain-body response, right? The brain is connected to the body, and that's how these responses are initiated. So we can either run away when we're exposed to a traumatic event, or we can fight, or some people freeze, and also some people shut down.
What is dissociation for people that, for example, never experience it?
Is a psychological escape when no physical escape is possible. And dissociation can refer to many different things. For example, having a flashback experience. So flashing back to the past, feeling like you're back at the scene of the trauma and reliving the trauma with all the physical sensations you had at the time of the trauma. That's one form of dissociation. Another form of dissociation is having an out-of-body experience. So seeing yourself from above, or walking behind yourself. And what this does is detaches you from the intensity of the emotion or the memory. Another form of dissociation is feeling like everything is unreal. It's not really happening. Another form of dissociation is a fragmentation of the self. So you have one self state that continues functioning in daily life because it's completely disconnected from the pain of the trauma. And this over time becomes, the experience of a fragmented sense of self, where people often lose chunks of time, where they're not aware of the part of themselves that carries the traumatic experience.
Are certain people more prone to experience trauma, and are other people, for example, capable of healing from trauma?
Only about 15% develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So absolutely, most people who experience trauma will actually heal from trauma. And we know the most important predictor of healing in the aftermath of trauma is social support.
So let's say different events can then shape different response of trauma.
Yeah. So just imagine yourself, Margot. You're witnessing a hurricane and you're traumatized by that versus being traumatized by another human being who maliciously assaults you. And just when I say that, what kind of reaction do you have? What event do you think would have a more profound effect?
Well, I am on the spot now, but I will say maybe the second one.
Yeah, right. This is an interpersonal trauma. Another human being, right, maliciously assaults us. And we know from the literature that, when we're hurt by another human, that has a greater risk of the development of PTSD following that, for example, than being exposed to a natural disaster, which happens by accident, which is induced by nature, right? Which doesn't have that other human being at the root.
I'm curious about how guilt then, or shame, or this kind of a feeling will be portrayed in one trauma or the other trauma.
That's a great question. And I think, when we have an interpersonal trauma, often, shame and guilt arise because the person often feels, if I could have done something different, this wouldn't have happened. Or this happened to me because I'm bad, because I'm deserving of negative experience.
I'm very interested in this mind-body connection. How
Mhm.
do you help your clients, and you teach other medical experts to help their client when they have difficulty to reconnect with their body after trauma?
Yeah, the first thing I teach people is to ground. And I think grounding can refer to many things. But what I've learned over the last several years is that one of the key things about being grounded on this earth is actually having gravitational security, feeling held by the earth, having a really well established balance system, which I think we lose in the aftermath of trauma. And so this often leads people not to feel like they have a center of balance and a center of gravity. And as a result, often they're clumsy and they don't know where they are in space.
What would you say to someone that doesn't know if has experienced trauma, but it feels that something is off?
I might ask, did anything ever happen in your life that made you feel haunted by something in the past, or that changed how you experience yourself in the world?
How do we experience our own self into the world? Is that what it is? To be, let's say, safe?
Yeah, it's all about how we experience ourselves, right? And if I don't feel safe inside, I'm unlikely to experience the world as safe, right? Because the internal world mirrors the external world.
How can we learn how to embrace safety after a traumatic event?
I think one of the key questions is, can those treatments restore the connection between the lower and the higher brain levels? We have some very new brain imaging data that support these hypotheses that are currently being reviewed for publication.
So you can't give us a tiny bit of, a teaser?
Yes, I can give you a bit of a teaser.
Please.
That in one treatment we studied called deep brain reorienting, we see a reconnection of the lower with the higher parts of the brain, that vertical integration or that synchrony between lower and higher brain areas seems to be reestablished after treatment. We know that the brain is malleable. We know neuroplasticity is our friend. We know that the brain can change in the aftermath of trauma. Once we've healed from trauma, individuals often feel like the past is in the past now and it's no longer ever present. So I think there's a lot of hope here. And I think reestablishing the brain-body connection and that vertical integration, the communication between lower and higher brain areas, is one critical factor.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Lanius. It's been great to have you here.
It's been a privilege. Thank you so much, Margot.